Hey everyone, and welcome back to Pulp Hero Audio. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Robert E. Howard's Puritan fanatic, the self-proclaimed instrument of God's vengeance, Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane, who, with the look about him, this witch hunter, vampire hunter, slayer, that kind of thing. I mean, Solomon Kane really is the precursor to a lot of characters of that type, even down to the look of some of them. Everything from, Vampire Hunter D in anime, and then you think of characters like Blade or the Belmont clan in the Castlevania video game series. Then you've got your more modern interpretations of Van Helsing, even though, of course, the original Van Helsing appeared way back in Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. But yeah, Howard's Solomon Kane, a character that, while perhaps not as famous as Conan the Barbarian, I personally would still put him up there at least in Howard's top three as far as recognition is concerned, along with Cull of Atlantis. But yeah, Solomon Kane is a character that, I really dig the entire concept of the character. His look, his mannerisms, his outlook. Just a very interesting character. And it's kind of unfortunate that, as Howard kind of moved on into Conan, he sort of he abandoned Solomon. We only have a handful of stories and poems, and some of those stories, even being just fragments of stories, far less Solomon Kane material than we have of Conan. But what I really want to get into today is, as much as I like the character and as much as I admire and respect, pretty much all of the stories and things that Howard wrote about the character, there were several of the stories, and again, when you're talking about, 3 or 4 stories in the Solomon Kane canon, that's taking up a pretty good bulk of what we have of Howard Solomon Kane. Well, Howard set several of the Kane stories in Africa, and while, again, I respect and admire the writing and the creativity, and while there were definitely some cool, interesting concepts in there, Howard's version of African vampires, the staff that Solomon Kane acquires from an African witch doctor, staff with a very long history going back to, the kings of Atlantis, and it was the rod that Moses had. It became the scepter of, King Solomon of Israel, whom you read about in the Old Testament of the Bible and so on. So a lot of really neat ideas, but for me personally, and, don't get angry with me, Howard fans, but for me personally, I don't like the setting. I don't really like Solomon Kane in Africa. I know it's kind of a fish out of water thing, this pale European Puritan guy, in the middle of Africa, that kind of thing, thinking about Tarzan and stuff like that. But I just don't like Kane in that setting. And I'm not taking anything away from, the character or the writing or the stories itself or the stories themselves. They're fine. I enjoy them. I just don't care for Kane in that particular setting because when I think of Solomon Kane, I'm picturing, dark, haunted forests, or maybe some action on the high seas or something like that. But definitely, dark, haunted forests and shadowy castles. That whole the whole gothic romance sort of vibe is what I get from Solomon Kane, and that's really what I want to see in Solomon Kane. But unfortunately, Howard only wrote so many stories, and quite a few of them are set in Africa. And it's just not a setting that, in my mind, to me, matches Solomon Kane very well. And maybe that was Howard's whole point, to put this character that really seems out of place into such a setting. But, I would much rather have seen more of his stories set, in Europe, or even the Americas. Howard alludes to the fact that, Kane did visit the New World, but, we never actually got a story set there, which I think could have been cool too, there on the frontier and that kind of thing. In fact, a couple of my favorite Solomon Kane stories, oddly enough, are just fragments. The Castle of the Devil and Death's Black Riders are just fragments, tiny pieces of a story. But yet the seed was there, everything was set up just in those few lines, few paragraphs, a couple of pages here and there that Howard wrote that for me set up what would have been a couple of great Solomon Kane stories, because these really were the kinds of Solomon Kane stories I most would want to read. And again, I can read something, like Red Shadows or any of the other Solomon Kane stories that are set in Africa. I can enjoy them. I can find something worth appreciating, certainly worth respecting there. But, I really wish that Howard had, first of all, spent more time with the character. Even as he was getting involved with Conan, I wish he had occasionally stepped back and revisited Solomon Kane as well, and maybe, finished a couple of those stories, or wrote some other ones that were maybe not set in Africa, or kind of out of sorts places like that for a character like Kane. Now, mentioning Death's Black Riders and the Castle of the Devil, I recently discovered, and again, you might be thinking, where have you been, man? But still, I recently discovered that, several years ago, Dark Horse Comics did do miniseries in which they did finish, if you will, those two Howard stories. And I was recently able to pick up, at a very good deal, I might add, those volumes where Dark Horse took those fragments and fleshed them out and completed them. And I plan on reading those very soon, and I hope they are good, and I hope they are perhaps a bit more of what I personally would have liked to have seen in Solomon Kane. Nothing wrong with Solomon Kane in Africa. There's plenty of good things to find, interesting points, concepts in those stories, but I really would have liked to have seen more of Solomon Kane out of Africa than what we got, as those African tales do take up quite a bit of the Solomon Kane canon. So that's all I've got for this one, guys. Just some thoughts on some of the Solomon Kane stories. Let me know what you think in the comments. Be sure and like or subscribe if you haven't done that. Really appreciate it. Lets me know that I'm reaching somebody out there. That there are those out there in the world that still appreciate these old pulp stories and things like that. All right, thanks, guys.